I woke up many mornings trying to understand the exact moment when I stopped deserving a response. I replayed old conversations, rewrote scenes in my head, searched for mistakes that could justify that distance. But silence explains nothing. It only charges a price. It charges dignity. It charges self-worth. It charges sleepless nights. And the more I tried to break it, the stronger it became. It was like talking to a wall that somehow still seemed to be judging me. It was in that place of emotional exhaustion that the letter was born, not as a beautiful gesture, not as a romantic act, but as a necessity. I needed to release what was consuming me from the inside. I needed to organize feelings that no longer fit in my chest. I needed to try, one last time, to be seen without having to shout. The letter was not written in anger. It was written in exhaustion, a deep exhaustion that comes from asking for attention in silence for far too long. Maybe you listening right now know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe there was a moment in your life when you felt invisible inside a relationship, inside a family, inside a story that was supposed to be a refuge but turned into distance. Stories like this don't belong to a single place or a single person. They cross borders, cultures, ages. That's why, before continuing, I want to invite you to write in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your state, your country. Not out of curiosity, but because this story is made of many voices, including yours. While I was writing that letter, I believed that silence could still be crossed, that honest words would be strong enough to open a crack, that love, when explained with care, could still be recognized. Each line carried an attempt at reconciliation, with myself and with the other person. I didn't write to accuse. I wrote to exist, to leave a record that I had been there, whole, truthful, available. But there's something almost no one teaches us. Silence is also an answer. And sometimes it doesn't come to be broken, but to be understood. There are people who use silence as control, as punishment, as a way to maintain emotional power. And when you don't understand that in time, you end up believing you need to try harder, explain yourself better, shrink yourself even more to deserve attention. That letter marked the beginning of a change I didn't yet fully understand. It wasn't born from naive hope, but from a final attempt at dignity. And maybe that's why so many people recognize themselves in that initial moment. Because almost everyone at some point in life has tried to explain themselves to someone who didn't want to listen, has written long messages, rehearsed conversations, put everything into words that were never welcomed. If you've lived something like this, stay with me until the end of this story. What began as an attempt to be heard ended as an awakening I never imagined. And what happened after that letter left my hands completely changed the way I came to see silence, people, and myself. When that letter began to take shape, I understood that I wasn't dealing with paper, ink, or carefully chosen words. I was dealing with myself. Each sentence was a piece of my heart I had never been able to expose out loud. There was no rehearsal, no protection. What was there was raw, real, vulnerable. Forgiveness mixed with pain. Love crossed by regret. Hope living side by side with the fear of being ignored once again. I had to take deep breaths many times while writing, because some truths hurt more when they come from within us than when they're caused by others. Recognizing how much I had endured in silence, how much I had adapted to fit into spaces that kept getting smaller, was not easy. That letter wasn't an apology for who I was, but an acknowledgement of what I felt. And that requires courage. It requires emotional maturity. It requires accepting that love can hurt too when there is no reciprocity. There was forgiveness in it, yes. A forgiveness that wasn't born because the other deserved it, but because I needed to stop carrying that weight. There was pain, because some absences don't heal quickly. There was regret for staying too long waiting for gestures that never came. But there was also love, because real love doesn't disappear overnight. It just changes places. Sometimes it leaves the relationship and returns inward. As I wrote, I realized how many women live this in silence. Women who were taught from an early age to swallow their feelings, to keep the peace, to not seem difficult, to not lose connections. Strong, mature women who hold entire families together, yet find no space to be fragile. If you recognize yourself in this, write "I understand" in the comments. These simple words create invisible bridges between stories that never met, yet resemble each other deeply. Every word in that letter was written with care, not to persuade, but to be faithful. I didn't want to create impact. I wanted to create truth. I wanted that, if it were read, there would be no doubt about who I was and what I felt. But at the same time, there was fear. Fear of being seen as too much, fear of being judged, fear of being ignored, fear of confirming what silence had been saying for so long. Still, I kept writing. Because there comes a moment in life when you understand that staying quiet hurts more than exposing yourself, that holding feelings in for too long corrodes you from the inside. That not speaking is also a way of abandoning yourself. That letter was an act of self-respect before anything else, a gesture from someone who decided to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Maybe you've also written something you were never sure would be read. Maybe you sent long messages full of meaning and received short replies, or no reply at all. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Stories like this aren't only about rejection, they're about emotional awareness, about understanding how far it's worth going, how long it's worth insisting, how much it's worth waiting. If this part of the story is touching you, write the word truth in the comments, because that's what this letter represented for me. Truth. No filters, no strategy, no emotional games, just the honest exposure of feelings that needed to come out so that something new could begin, even if I didn't yet know what. The hardest part was accepting that by putting my heart on that paper, I was giving up control. I couldn't decide how it would be received. I couldn't choose the other person's reaction. I could only choose to stop lying to myself. And that choice changes everything. It changes how you see yourself, how you position yourself, how you value yourself. That letter wasn't born from innocence, but from emotional exhaustion. And maybe that's why so many people connect with stories like this, because they speak to a common point, the limit, the moment when you realize you've done everything you could, felt everything you needed to feel, and now you have to listen to your own conscience. What happened after that letter was finished deserves to be told slowly, because that's where a revelation began, one that wasn't on the paper, but inside me. When I decided to hand over that letter, I still didn't fully understand what I was doing to myself. It wasn't just an envelope passing from one hand to another. It was a gesture carrying invisible weight, a kind of silent power that only those who have truly exposed themselves emotionally can understand. Because the moment you give someone a letter, you give up control. You give your version of events, your most intimate feelings, your vulnerabilities, and accept that all of it will be in the hands of someone who may treat it with care or with contempt. There is a dangerous illusion many people carry, the idea that if we are honest enough, if we choose the right words, if we show emotional maturity, the other person will be forced to understand. But the truth is that understanding doesn't come from the clarity of words. It comes from the openness of the heart that receives them. And that has never been under our control. By placing that letter in her hands, I was entrusting something far too precious. I was saying, without saying it, this is who I am. This is what I felt. This is what I endured. It's an act that requires courage, but also reveals how willing we still are to place ourselves in a vulnerable position. Many women confuse this with weakness, but it isn't. Weakness is pretending indifference when everything inside is falling apart. Giving someone a letter is an act of emotional faith, even when hope is already tired. Maybe you following this story have lived something similar. Maybe you've placed your feelings in the wrong hands. Maybe you trusted your truth to someone who didn't have the maturity to hold it. If this resonates with you, write the word power in the comments, because recognizing that moment is the first step toward reclaiming what was given without care. When we give someone a letter, we also give expectations, even when we swear we don't. We expect respect, attention, consideration. At the very least, we expect it to be taken seriously. And when that doesn't happen, the impact isn't only on the relationship, it's on the way we see ourselves. We start questioning whether we overdid it, whether we felt too much, whether we should have stayed quiet. This kind of doubt eats away at self-esteem from the inside out. What no one talks about is that emotional exposure is a powerful currency, but a dangerous one. In the right hands, it builds bridges. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. And many women learn this too late, after years of offering their best to people who knew how to receive, but not how to care. This story isn't about blame. It's about awareness, about understanding that not everyone deserves access to our truth. While that letter was no longer in my hands, something began to reorganize inside me. For the first time, I realized I no longer had control over the narrative. What would be done with those words no longer depended on me, and oddly enough, that brought deep discomfort, but also a strange sense of relief, because carrying everything alone for so long had been exhausting. Now, the risk had been taken. This is a decisive point in anyone's emotional life. It's when we understand that vulnerability doesn't guarantee reciprocity. That love doesn't force anyone to mature. That truth doesn't compel anyone to listen. And accepting that hurts. It hurts because it dismantles old fantasies, but it also strengthens you. It strengthens you because it gives you back responsibility for yourself. If you've ever felt you gave too much power to someone, write "learning" in the comments. These words help others recognize themselves and become aware of their own emotional boundaries. Stories like this aren't individual. They repeat themselves in different homes, cultures, generations. The names change, the settings change, but the emotional pattern remains the same. Handing over that letter was a silent turning point, not because I expected a specific answer, but because in that moment, even without fully realizing it, I was letting go of an old illusion, the belief that I needed validation to feel whole. This kind of liberation doesn't happen dramatically. It begins slowly, almost imperceptibly, the moment you realize you've already done everything within your reach. Still, the heart doesn't move at the same speed as reason. There's a painful gap between giving up power and reclaiming yourself, a space where anxiety tries to take over, where the mind creates scenarios, where the other person's silence starts gaining meanings that may not even exist. This is the space where many people abandon themselves in an attempt to save relationships that are already emotionally unbalanced. I stayed in that space long enough to understand something important. The problem was never feeling too much. The problem was giving too much to someone who didn't know what to do with it. And that realization changes how you position yourself in the world. It changes your choices, your boundaries, your emotional priorities. If this part of the story is speaking to you, write "awareness" in the comments, because emotional awareness is what separates those who repeat patterns from those who begin to break them. And everything that came after that seemingly simple gesture revealed something I wasn't ready to see at the time, something that only became clear when the response, or the lack of it, began to take shape too clearly to be ignored. And it was right there, in that point of silent waiting, that I realized giving someone a letter doesn't end a story. Sometimes it only opens the door to a much greater truth, one that isn't found in the written words, but in the reaction of the person who receives them. When she took the letter in her hands, time seemed to slow down in a nearly cruel way. I saw the gesture, simple on the outside, but loaded with a tension that ran through my entire body. The envelope was turned over, weighed, examined as if it weren't made of paper, but of something dangerous. In that instant, I still didn't know I was about to witness one of the most silently violent scenes of my emotional life. She opened the letter, and that detail matters, because opening creates expectation. Opening creates the illusion that there will be consideration. Opening suggests that something will be received, but she opened it and didn't read it. There was no rush, no curiosity, not even open contempt. It was worse. It was organized indifference. The paper came out of the envelope, was glanced over from top to bottom, folded again with almost ironic care, and set aside as if it were an object of no value. In that moment, I understood that silence could take shape. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was there, materialized in a cold, calculated gesture that was impossible to misread. What hurt wasn't a declared refusal. It was the absence of reaction. Because when someone refuses to listen, there is still confrontation. There is still conflict. But when someone simply ignores you, the message cuts deeper. What you feel isn't worth even my time. And that is a wound that doesn't bleed on the outside, but spreads inside with frightening speed. I stood, still, trying to maintain dignity while inside something collapsed in silence. Many people think rejection is hearing a no, but anyone who has lived something like this knows that the most painful rejection is the one that comes without words. It's when you offer your truth and receive emptiness in return. If you've lived this, write "silence hurts" in the comments. This isn't dramatization, it's emotional recognition. And recognizing it is the first step toward not normalizing this kind of emotional violence. As she set the letter aside, I realized it wasn't just the text being ignored. It was the story, the feeling, the courage it took to write every line, everything I represented in that bond. That simple gesture revealed something words could never explain. It revealed that for some people, no matter how much you try, open up, or explain yourself, they have already decided not to feel. The silence in that moment was deafening. It screamed rejection, contempt, control, and the more I tried to understand it, the clearer it became that there was nothing to interpret. The message was too direct to ignore. She didn't need to read because she had already chosen not to engage. She had already chosen not to take emotional responsibility. She had already chosen to keep her distance, even with everything exposed right in front of her. Experiences like this change you, because it's not just about the other person. It's about what happens inside you afterward. The mind starts revisiting every written word, every exposed feeling, searching for flaws that might justify the contempt. We start negotiating with our own self-worth. We start thinking we should have been less sincere, less deep, less true. That's the danger. The other person's silence tries to teach us to shrink. If you've ever caught yourself wanting to make yourself smaller to fit into someone's indifference, write "enough" in the comments. That word carries power. It marks an invisible boundary that many women take years to establish because we were taught to insist, to understand, to let things slide. But no one taught us how to leave when dignity starts being negotiated. In that instant, I felt a strange mix of humiliation and clarity. Humiliation from realizing my heart had been treated as something disposable. Clarity from understanding, perhaps for the first time, that a choice was being made, and it wasn't mine. The decision not to read was more revealing than any answer could have been. It said everything without saying a word. The body feels it before the mind understands. My chest tightened, my hands went cold, and a sense of exposure took over me. It wasn't shame over what I had written. It was shame for believing that space still existed. And that distinction matters, because the problem was never the letter. The problem was believing the other person was emotionally available to receive it. That moment marks a before and after in the life of anyone who experiences it, because it forces you to face an uncomfortable truth. Not all silence is confusion. Some silences are carefully made decisions, and insisting on breaking them can cost far too much. It can cost peace, self-esteem, emotional identity. If this part of the story is stirring something in you, write "I saw it" in the comments, because seeing is different from accepting. Seeing is the beginning of awakening. And what came after that seemingly simple gesture revealed something even deeper, something that only became clear when I realized that what hurt me most wasn't that she hadn't read the letter, but the amount of time I was still willing to wait for someone who had already shown, without words, that she had no intention of listening. After that moment when the letter was opened and set aside, the hardest part of the entire story began. It wasn't the gesture itself that hurt me most, because that gesture, as harsh as it was, lasted only seconds. What truly consumed me was what came afterward, the waiting, a silent, long, draining wait that seemed endless, waiting for a different look, for the smallest change in attitude, for any sign that all of it had made some impact. And that's where the deepest humiliation lives, when you've already been ignored, yet you still wait for the other person to care. Waiting has a strange power. It creates a kind of suspension of life. Days keep passing, people keep living, but you remain trapped in that invisible space between what happened and what may never happen. Every movement of the other person is observed with exaggerated attention. Every silence becomes interpretation. Every delay becomes hope mixed with fear. And without realizing it, you begin organizing your emotional life around the reaction of someone who has already shown they are unavailable. I waited in silence. I waited with apparent dignity, But inside, there was a constant conflict between pride and the need for validation. Part of me said, I shouldn't expect anything, that the answer had already been given in the gesture. Another part insisted on believing it might just be a matter of time, that maybe she was processing, reflecting, organizing her feelings. That second part is the most dangerous because it keeps us trapped in bonds that no longer offer reciprocity. Waiting exhausts you. Waiting wears you down. Waiting erodes self-esteem slowly and almost imperceptibly. You start waking up wondering if that day will be different. You begin justifying cold, distant, indifferent behavior. You start shrinking your own emotional needs so you won't seem too demanding. And when you realize it, you're already negotiating the bare minimum: attention, respect, consideration. If you've lived this, write "I waited" in the comments. Those two words carry more history than most people realize. The cruelest part of waiting is that it puts us in an unequal position. While you wait, the other person remains in control. They decide when to speak, if they speak, how they speak, and you, even unwillingly, accept that imbalance. Not because you like it, but because you still believe that bond deserves one more chance. Many strong, mature, experienced women go through this. It's not a lack of strength, it's an excess of giving. As days passed, I began to notice that waiting was turning me into someone I didn't recognize, more anxious, more insecure, more silent about what I felt. I was shaping myself around the other person's emptiness, trying to fit into indifference, trying not to disturb. And that is deeply humiliating. Not because the other person humiliates us directly, but because we begin abandoning ourselves to preserve a hope that should have already been reconsidered. If this part of the story is touching you, write "validation hurts" in the comments, because it really does. It hurts when you realize you're waiting to be validated by someone who shows no interest in validating your feelings. It hurts when you understand you're placing your worth in the hands of someone who doesn't know how, or doesn't want, to recognize it. This kind of pain doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, seeps into thoughts, decisions, the way you see yourself. Waiting also creates a cruel inner dialogue. You start wondering if you overdid it, if you should have been more restrained, if speaking was a mistake. You begin revisiting every word of the letter, searching for something that might have pushed the other person even further away. And this constant self-criticism is a form of silent punishment. You carry emotional responsibility alone, while the other person remains comfortable in their silence. Time kept passing, and with it came an exhaustion that's hard to explain. It wasn't physical tiredness, it was emotional fatigue, the kind that weighs on the body even when you haven't made any effort. I was tired of waiting, tired of interpreting, tired of justifying, tired of holding up a bridge that only I crossed. And still, something inside me resisted letting go completely, because letting go also hurts. Letting go means accepting that things won't change. Maybe you're in that place right now. Maybe you're waiting for a message, a call, an apology, a recognition that never comes. If that's you, write "I deserve more" in the comments. That phrase isn't arrogance, it's awareness. And awareness is what begins to break exhausting emotional cycles. The hardest part was understanding that waiting was no longer connected to love but to fear. Fear of facing the end. Fear of admitting I had gone too far alone. Fear of recognizing that the story no longer held the same meaning for both sides. While I waited for validation, life was asking for a decision. And that realization didn't come all at once. It formed slowly, through sleepless nights and repetitive thoughts. The humiliation of waiting isn't in waiting for someone to respond. It's in continuing to wait after the signs have already been given. It's in insisting on someone who has already emotionally withdrawn. It's in postponing your own healing to maintain an illusion of control. And when that realization starts to settle in, something inside you begins to change. Even if you don't yet know exactly how to act on it, that period of waiting revealed much more about me than about her. It revealed my limits, my old wounds, my difficulty accepting that not every emotional investment returns. And it was in that uncomfortable space between hope and frustration that I began to realize that perhaps the biggest mistake hadn't been writing the letter or delivering it or exposing myself, Perhaps the mistake was continuing to wait for someone who had chosen silence to suddenly choose care. It took me time to understand this, because when we're wounded, the first thing we do is doubt ourselves. I reread that letter countless times in my mind. I revisited every sentence, every chosen word, every exposed feeling. I analyzed whether I had been too clear, too sensitive, too intense. I spent nights trying to find flaws in the text, as if the rejection had been caused by a formatting error, a poorly placed word, a feeling expressed at the wrong time. For a long time, I believed that if I had written differently, the outcome would have been different. But this is a common trap for those who feel deeply. We try to turn indifference into personal failure. We try to believe the problem lies in how we speak, not in the unavailability of the one who listens. Yet there comes a moment when awareness asserts itself, even against our will. A silent, uncomfortable moment when something inside whispers that perhaps the text was never the problem. That realization didn't come as immediate relief. It came as a shock, because accepting that the problem wasn't the text meant accepting something much harder, that the other person's heart was already closed before the letter was even opened. And that changes everything. It changes the narrative. It changes the weight of guilt. It changes how you see the rejection. It wasn't a lack of clarity. It wasn't too much emotion. It was a lack of openness on the other side. When that truth began to sink in, I felt a mix of pain and liberation. Pain from realizing I was trying to reach someone who had already decided not to be reached. Liberation from understanding there was nothing more I could have done differently. I had already done my best. I had been honest, respectful, emotionally mature. The rest was not up to me, and that understanding lifts an enormous weight off your shoulders, even if your chest still aches. Many women live trapped in this cycle of endless self-correction, always thinking they need to explain better, speak more gently, feel less, ask for less, always believing that if they adjust just one more detail, they'll finally be heard. But the truth is, there is no word capable of opening a heart that has chosen to remain closed. If this resonates with you, write, "It wasn't me," in the comments. That simple phrase can be a powerful rescue for those who spent years blaming themselves in silence. When I realized that the problem wasn't the text, I began to reconsider other situations in my life. Conversations that never progressed, feelings that were never acknowledged, constant attempts at dialogue with people who responded with distance. The pattern became too clear to ignore. I wasn't failing in communication. I was insisting on emotionally unavailable bonds. And this is something many people take a lifetime to realize. This shift in awareness doesn't happen all at once. It builds gradually through small, silent epiphanies. In moments when you realize you're explaining yourself too much to someone who shows no real interest in understanding. On days when you come to the realization that you're carrying a bond on your own that should have been supported by two people. In moments when the silence of the other no longer seems confusing, but intentional. If you've ever felt like you were talking to someone who didn't seem emotionally present, write "closed heart" in the comments. Not as a judgment, but as a fact. Some people simply aren't ready to deal with deep emotions. They don't know how to embrace, how to dialogue, how to take emotional responsibility. And this isn't something a letter, no matter how well written, can change. Realizing this was liberating because it gave me back something I had lost during the waiting, my sense of worth. I stopped measuring my worth by the other person's reaction. I stopped believing I needed to prove something. I stopped revisiting my emotions as if they were excessive. My emotions were valid. My text was truthful. The problem was never there. It was in the inability of the person receiving it to connect with it. This awareness changes the way you position yourself in the world. You begin to speak less to convince and more to express. You begin to choose more carefully who you open up to. You start to respect your own emotional boundaries. And most importantly, you begin to understand that silence isn't always confusion. Sometimes it's rejection. And rejection is also an answer, even when it comes without words. If this part of the story is resonating with you, write "I free myself" in the comments. Not as a definitive act, but as a process. Emotional liberation doesn't happen overnight. It starts the moment you stop blaming yourself for what wasn't under your control. And when I accepted that, something inside me began to silently reorganize, preparing the ground for an even deeper understanding of why some people choose not to feel, not to read, not to engage, even when everything is clearly exposed in front of them. It took me a while to accept this truth, because it requires emotional maturity. It requires stopping the search for villains and starting to see human limits. Some people don't read because they can't bear to feel. It's not simple disinterest. It's not lack of time. It's not distraction. It's emotional incapacity. It's the fear of facing emotions that would require responsibility, change, and a stand. Reading that letter would mean confronting emotions they weren't ready to recognize, let alone manage. There are people who build their emotional survival by avoiding depth, people who have learned to live on the surface because anything too deep scares them. Intense emotions require presence, empathy, maturity. They require admitting flaws, acknowledging the pain caused, dealing with consequences. For those who have spent their lives running from this, not reading is a form of self-protection. Not allowing space for feeling is the only way for them to maintain control. When I understood this, something inside me calmed down. It wasn't immediate relief, but clarity. I stopped personalizing that rejection. I stopped seeing it as a direct attack on my essence. I began to see it as the other person's limitation. And this change in perspective makes all the difference. Because while you think the other person didn't read because of a lack of love, you hurt yourself. But when you understand the other person didn't read because of emotional incapacity, you start to liberate yourself. This reflection doesn't come from resentment. It comes from maturity. It's possible to have compassion without erasing yourself. It's possible to understand without justifying. Some people simply don't know how to deal with deep emotions. They don't know how to sustain difficult conversations. They don't know how to take emotional responsibility. And when confronted with something that requires that, they shut down, pull away, become silent. Not because you said too much, but because they can't listen. If you've realized you've tried to engage with someone who always ran away, write clarity in the comments. Because emotional clarity saves time, energy, and dignity. It stops you from continuing to try to open doors that are already locked from the inside. And most importantly, it stops you from offering precious parts of yourself to someone who doesn't know how to care. Emotional immaturity shows up in small gestures, in the difficulty of having a conversation, the tendency to avoid conflict, the habit of staying silent when something requires a stance. These people prefer the comfort of unspoken words over the responsibility of dialogue. They prefer to appear strong rather than be honest. They prefer the control of silence over the risk of vulnerability. And understanding this completely changes how you interpret their behavior. I started to see that refusal to read wasn't personal, but structural. It was about how they deal with emotions, not about the value of what I felt. And this distinction is fundamental for any emotional healing process. Because while you think you were rejected for who you are, the pain deepens. But when you understand you were rejected because the other person doesn't know how to feel, the pain begins to transform into clarity. If this part of the story is resonating with you, write, "It wasn't about me" in the comments. This phrase helps reposition old wounds. It helps lift the burden from those who have always carried too much responsibility. It helps break the cycle of trying to convince someone who's unwilling to understand. Emotional escape is often accompanied by vague justifications, prolonged silences, subtle, behavioral changes. There's no direct confrontation, no clear explanation, just withdrawal. And this confuses those who value dialogue, truth, depth. These people tend to leave trails of doubt wherever they go because they never clearly say what they feel or don't feel. And those left behind trying to understand end up emotionally drained. Over time, I realized that insisting on being read by someone who can't bear to feel is a form of self-violence. It's like speaking to someone who refuses to listen. The more you speak, the more you expose yourself, the more exhausted you become, and the other person remains untouched, protected by their own emotional unavailability. This imbalance is unfair, but common, and it only breaks when you decide to stop insisting. This understanding brought empathy, but it also brought boundaries. Empathy without boundaries turns into self-neglect, and I had already neglected myself for far too long trying to be understood. Understanding that some people don't read because they can't bear to feel was a quiet turning point. Not to accuse, not to judge, but to stop waiting for what wasn't coming. If you've ever felt like you were speaking to someone who shuts down every time the subject becomes deep, write boundary in the comments, because a boundary isn't coldness. A boundary is self-respect. It's recognizing how far it's worth going, how much to insist, how much to expose. And this awareness doesn't come all at once. It's built slowly, from experiences like this one that hurt but teach. From this understanding, I began to look at other relationships with more attention. I began to notice who was emotionally available and who was simply occupying space. I started to differentiate who knew how to feel from who only knew how to avoid. And this changed my choices, my expectations, and my way of relating. But this process was still unfolding, because understanding rationally is one step. Living with the consequences of that. Understanding is something very different. And it was exactly at this point that something even deeper began to reveal itself within me, opening up space for a transformation that I didn't yet know how to name. When I finally stopped waiting for something that would never come, I started to realize a truth that had been hidden by pain and expectation until then. The letter had already done its job, even without being read, even without a response, even without external validation. It had done exactly what needed to be done within me, because, deep down, that writing was never about convincing anyone, but about giving myself back to myself. That's when healing began to creep in, not as immediate relief, but as a quiet reorganization of what was out of place. Writing was an act of self-respect, an intimate gesture of emotional honesty. It was the first time in a long while that I didn't swallow my feelings to keep the peace, that I didn't soften my pain to avoid seeming excessive, that I didn't silence myself to fit into someone else's comfort. The letter was the space where I allowed myself to be whole without asking for permission. And that has a transformative power that many people underestimate, because when you express yourself truthfully, something realigns inside, even if the world outside stays the same. For a long time, I believed that closure had to come from the other person. A conversation, an apology, an explanation, anything that would provide a dignified conclusion to that story. But life gradually showed me that not every closure is granted. Some need to be built internally. And that doesn't mean resignation. It means emotional maturity. It means stopping the outsourcing of your own peace. If you've ever waited for someone to give you an answer to move on, write "I move on" in the comments. Not as a challenge, but as an affirmation. Because moving on isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending it didn't hurt. Moving on is accepting that you don't need permission to set yourself free. The letter taught me this. It wasn't ignored in vain. It fulfilled its mission the moment it made me realize I no longer needed to carry everything alone. From that moment on, something began to shift in my demeanor, not in a radical or immediate way, but consistently. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped justifying legitimate feelings. I stopped striving to be understood by someone who had already shown they didn't want to listen. This change didn't come with grand speeches. It came with small daily decisions, with more conscious silences, with choices better aligned with what I felt, not what others expected of me. Emotional healing is rarely noisy. It doesn't come with announcements or promises. It comes as an internal adjustment, almost imperceptible, but deep. You begin to sleep better. You begin to breathe with less weight on your chest. You start to look at yourself with more kindness. And little by little, you realize that what seemed unbearable no longer dominates your thoughts all the time. The letter was the starting point of that process, not because it was read, but because it was written. If this part of the story resonates with you, write self-respect in the comments. This word carries powerful meaning, especially for women who have spent their whole lives putting others first. Self-respect is recognizing that your feelings matter, even when no one else seems willing to recognize them. It's stopping the self-blame for feeling. It's stopping the self-punishment for loving. I started to understand that expressing what we feel isn't a favor we do for others. It's a commitment we make to ourselves. Holding too many emotions in creates emotional illness. It creates resentment, accumulated sadness, a sense of invisibility. The letter was a healthy outlet. It prevented that pain from becoming something even harder to carry. And that, in itself, was a huge gain. Many people live trapped in the idea that healing will only come when the other person acknowledges their wrongs. But this emotional dependency prolongs suffering. While you wait for external recognition, your life is suspended. When you realize you can recognize yourself on your own, something unlocks. It's not easy. It requires internal confrontation. It requires letting go of old fantasies. But it's liberating. If you've realized you're waiting too much from someone who shows no willingness to change, write, "I choose myself" in the comments. This choice isn't selfish. It's emotional survival. The letter showed me that I could choose myself without hurting anyone else. I could move on without attacking, without accusing, without creating new conflicts. I just needed to accept that that chapter had ended the way it had to, not the way I wanted. As time went on, I began to look at that letter with new eyes. It stopped representing rejection and started symbolizing courage. The courage to feel, the courage to speak, the courage to stop pretending. And this change in meaning is an essential part of healing. Because when you reframe the experience, it stops being an open wound and becomes a lesson integrated into your story. This liberation didn't erase the pain entirely, but it took away the control it had over me. I no longer revolved around the expectation of a response. I no longer organized my days around the other person's silence. The letter had done its quiet work. It had returned the clarity that I no longer needed to insist where there was no reciprocity. Now, on the screen, there is another video of the matriarch's secrets waiting for you. A new story, a new perspective, another lesson that touches different wounds but speaks the same truth. Stay with me. Each story is independent, but all carry wisdom for those who are ready to listen, feel, and grow.